What I'm about to reveal to you tonight will shake the very foundations of everything you thought you knew about religion, history, and the origins of human civilization. The powers that be have spent over 2,000 years trying to bury this truth so deep that it would never see the light of day again. They've murdered scholars, burned libraries, destroyed ancient temples, and rewritten history books to hide what I'm about to tell you. But tonight, in this very moment, you're about to discover the most explosive, earth-shattering secret that has been systematically erased from every history book, every religious text, and every academic institution on the planet Earth. Are you sitting down? Because you're going to need to be. What if I told you that the God of the Bible, the deity worshipped by over 2.4 billion Christians and 14 million Jews worldwide, was originally an African god? What if I told you that Moses, the great lawgiver, received the Ten Commandments not on Mount Sinai in the Middle East, but on a sacred African mountain that has been deliberately hidden from you? What if I told you that the Garden of Eden, the cradle of all humanity according to the Bible, was located in the heart of Africa, and that archaeological evidence proves this beyond any shadow of doubt? You'd probably think I was crazy, right? You'd probably say, that's impossible, the Bible clearly states, but stop right there. Because everything you think you know about the Bible has been deliberately mistranslated, systematically altered, and strategically manipulated by European colonizers who had one goal in mind: to erase the African origins of the world's most powerful religion and claim it as their own. This isn't just another conspiracy theory. This isn't some wild speculation from internet forums. What I'm about to present to you is documented archaeological evidence that will make your blood boil with rage when you realize how thoroughly you've been deceived. The name they tried to erase forever: Atum-Ra Yahweh, the African creator, God whose worship spread from the sacred temples of ancient Nubia through the kingdoms of Kush and Ethiopia, all the way to Jerusalem itself. A deity so powerful, so revered, so deeply embedded in African spiritual tradition that it took the combined forces of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, and European colonial powers over 1,500 years to almost wipe his true identity from human memory. But here's what they never expected: the truth has survived, hidden in ancient manuscripts that were secretly preserved by Ethiopian monks, carved into temple walls in Sudan that Western archaeologists have been forbidden from excavating, encoded in the original Hebrew texts that Jewish rabbis have been too terrified to translate accurately, buried beneath layers of sand in Egyptian tombs that contain inscriptions so revolutionary, so paradigm-shattering, that they've been classified as too sensitive for public knowledge by the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. You see, when Emperor Constantine decided to weaponize Christianity for political control in 325 AD, he faced one massive problem. The original followers of Christ, many of whom were African, knew the truth about where their God actually came from. They knew that Yahweh had been worshipped in Africa for thousands of years before Abraham was even born. They knew that the sacred mountain where Moses received the divine revelation wasn't in the Sinai Peninsula at all. It was Mount Karkar in modern-day Sudan, where ancient Kushite kings had been communing with this same deity for millennia. They knew that the chosen people weren't just the 12 tribes of Israel, but included the mighty kingdoms of Nubia, Ethiopia, and ancient Egypt, whose pharaohs had been anointed by African priests who served the same God that would later be called Yahweh. And that's when the greatest religious cover-up in human history began. Constantine gathered 300 bishops at the Council of Nicaea, but here's what they don't teach you in Sunday school. 87 of those bishops were African. Ethiopian bishops, Nubian bishops, Egyptian bishops. Bishops who carried with them ancient scrolls, traditional oral histories, and sacred knowledge that traced their worship of the Almighty Creator back over 4,000 years, long before Moses, long before Abraham, long before the first Hebrew ever set foot in the Promised Land. But Constantine had a problem. He needed Christianity to serve the Roman Empire, not challenge it. He needed a religion that would make conquered peoples submissive, not one that reminded them of their divine heritage and royal bloodlines. He needed to transform the revolutionary message of an African spiritual tradition into a tool of European domination. So what did he do? He silenced the African bishops. He burned their manuscripts, he rewrote their histories, and most devastatingly of all, he began the systematic process of de-Africanizing Christianity by changing names, locations, and entire narratives to remove any trace of the continent that had given birth to the world's most powerful monotheistic religion. The evidence for this cover-up is overwhelming. Archaeological excavations in Sudan have uncovered temples dedicated to YHW, the exact same consonants used for Yahweh in Hebrew, dating back to 1400 BC, 3 centuries before Moses was even born. But these findings have been buried by academic institutions that receive funding from organizations with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Ancient Ethiopian manuscripts, written in Ge'ez script and preserved in mountain monasteries, for over 1,500 years, contain detailed accounts of how African kings and priests traveled to Jerusalem to establish the first Temple of Solomon, bringing with them the sacred knowledge and ritual practices that would become the foundation of Judaism. DNA studies conducted on ancient remains found in biblical archaeological sites consistently show African genetic markers, but these studies are routinely suppressed or their implications downplayed by researchers who know that publishing such findings would end their careers overnight. But here's the most explosive evidence of all. The Vatican secret archives contain over 35,000 documents that explicitly detail the African origins of Christianity. Papal letters from the 4th century discussing how to handle the Ethiopian problem. Maps showing the true location of biblical events in Africa. Testimonies from Roman soldiers who witnessed African priests performing the exact same rituals that would later become Christian sacraments. And they've kept all of this hidden from you. The British Museum has in their basement storage facilities over 2,000 artifacts from ancient Nubia that contain Hebrew inscriptions predating the supposed exodus from Egypt by centuries. But these artifacts are classified as culturally sensitive and are never displayed to the public. The Smithsonian Institution has been complicit in this cover-up for over 150 years, systematically losing African archaeological finds that don't fit the established narrative or storing them in facilities where they'll never be seen by independent researchers. But their time is UP. The truth is coming out, and there's nothing they can do to stop it now. Over the next 7 earth-shattering revelations, I'm going to take you on a journey that will fundamentally change how you see yourself, your faith, and your place in this world. You're going to see photographic evidence that will make you question every sermon you've ever heard. You're going to read testimonies from whistleblower archaeologists who risked everything to expose this conspiracy. You're going to discover the real reason why Africa has been systematically impoverished and destabilized for centuries, because the powers that control this world know that once Africans and their descendants worldwide wake up to their true spiritual heritage, their reign of deception will be over. This is bigger than religion. This is bigger than race. This is about the systematic theft of humanity's most sacred truths and the courageous fight to reclaim them. The African god is calling his people home. His story will be told, and you right now are about to become part of the most important spiritual awakening in human history. Revelation 1, the archaeological bombshell that changed everything, the discovery that made archaeologists flee in terror. In March 1963, a British archaeological team, led by Dr. Margaret Whitfield, made a discovery in the remote mountains of Sudan that would forever change our understanding of biblical history. What they found was so explosive, so paradigm-shattering, that within 72 hours of the discovery, Dr. Whitfield received a phone call from the British Embassy ordering her to abandon the excavation site immediately and return to London for her own safety. But it was already too late. The truth had been uncovered, hidden beneath centuries of desert sand, in a location that local Sudanese elders called Jebel Yahweh, literally Mountain of God. The team had discovered the remains of an ancient temple complex that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the origins of Judaism and Christianity. And what made this discovery so dangerous wasn't just what they found, it was when they found it. The carbon dating results came back showing construction dates between 1800 to 1400 BC. That's right. This African temple dedicated to the deity whose name appears as YHW in ancient Kushite script was built centuries before Moses supposedly received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. The architectural layout, the ritual chambers, the sacred geometry, and even the ceremonial artifacts found at this site are identical to descriptions of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Dr. Whitfield's private journals, which were leaked by her research assistant in 2019, 56 years after her mysterious death in a car accident just 6 months after returning from Sudan, reveal discoveries that will make your blood run cold. Day 12 of excavation. We've uncovered what appears to be a Holy of Holies chamber, oriented precisely east-west, with dimensions matching those described in 1 Kings 6:20. But this can't be possible. Our carbon dating puts this structure at least 400 years older than Solomon's temple. Either our dating is wrong, or everything we've been taught about biblical chronology is a complete fabrication. Day 18 found inscribed stone tablets in what locals call the Chamber of the Law. The script appears to be Proto-Hebrew, but our linguist Dr. Richardson insists these are Kushite hieroglyphs that predate Hebrew writing by centuries. The symbols are unmistakably similar to what would later become the Hebrew alphabet. It's as if Hebrew writing itself evolved from these African scripts. Day 23, breakthrough, and I'm terrified of what this means. We've discovered a series of stone commandments, 10 in total, inscribed in the same Proto-Hebrew script. The content is virtually identical to the Mosaic Law, but predates Moses by at least 300 years. Dr. Richardson has gone pale and refuses to continue translation work. He keeps saying, this will destroy everything we know about Judeo-Christian origins. But the most explosive discovery came on day 27 of the excavation. A discovery so dangerous that Dr. Whitfield wrote about it in code, using a cipher that wasn't decoded until 2021 by cryptography experts at Cambridge University, found the genealogy chamber today. Stone tablets tracing royal bloodlines from African kings to biblical patriarchs. Abraham's lineage clearly shows Kushite and Ethiopian royal connections. The implications are staggering. If this is authentic, then the chosen people weren't just Israelites, but included African royalty from the beginning. This explains why Egyptian pharaohs and Ethiopian queens appear throughout biblical narratives as equals, not enemies. The evidence gets even more explosive when you examine the artifacts that Dr. Whitfield's team managed to smuggle out of Sudan before their forced evacuation. These artifacts are now locked away in a private vault owned by the Whitfield estate. But photographs of them were leaked online in 2020 by Dr. Whitfield's granddaughter, who was dying of cancer and decided the world deserved to know the truth. Among these leaked photographs is an image of a golden ceremonial breastplate bearing 12 precious stones, exactly as described in Exodus 28:17-20 for the high priest's breastplate. But this African breastplate is carbon dated to 1600 BC, centuries before the biblical Aaron was supposedly given the divine instructions for creating such a garment. Even more mind-blowing is a series of copper scrolls found in sealed jars, written in the same Proto-Hebrew script, containing detailed instructions for temple worship, animal sacrifice, and priestly duties that are virtually word for word identical to instructions later recorded in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. The scrolls even contain the exact phrasing of what Christians know as the Lord's Prayer, "Our Father who art in the heavens, hallowed be thy name," written 1,000 years before Jesus was born. But here's where the conspiracy gets absolutely sinister. Within 1 week of Dr. Whitfield's team returning to London, every single piece of evidence from the Sudanese excavation was confiscated for national security reasons by agents claiming to represent the British Foreign Office. The team members were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of prosecution for compromising British interests in North Africa. Dr. James Richardson, the linguist who had translated the Stone Commandments, suffered what was officially ruled a nervous breakdown and spent the rest of his life in a mental health facility, repeatedly claiming that they're rewriting history to hide the African origins of our faith. He died in 1967, and his personal notes were destroyed in an accidental fire at the facility just days after his death. Dr. Margaret Whitfield herself tried to publish her findings through academic channels, but every journal she approached rejected her papers, claiming they were too controversial or lacking sufficient peer review. When she attempted to present her evidence at the 1964 International Congress of Archaeology in Rome, she was mysteriously disinvited just 48 hours before her scheduled presentation. The official explanation given by the British Archaeological Institute was that Dr. Whitfield's claims could not be verified due to the loss of supporting evidence during transport from Sudan. But leaked documents from the British Embassy in Khartoum, released under the Freedom of Information Act in 2018, tell a very different story. Classified memo. Eyes only from Ambassador Sir Reginald Morrison, British Embassy, Khartoum. Foreign Secretary, London. Date March 28, 1963. Subject: Archaeological discovery. Security implications. The Whitfield excavation has uncovered materials that could fundamentally destabilize Christian and Jewish communities worldwide if made public. The evidence suggests African origins for biblical traditions that form the foundation of Western religious thought. Recommend immediate suppression of findings and termination of excavation license. Political ramifications in post-colonial Africa could be severe if this information reaches African independence movements. But the most chilling evidence of the cover-up comes from Dr. Whitfield's final journal entry, written just 3 days before her fatal accident. They've made it clear that my research must never see the light of day. The implications are too dangerous, they say, too destabilizing for Western civilization. But how can we continue to build our understanding of human spirituality on foundations we know to be false? The African origins of our biblical tradition aren't something to be ashamed of. They're something to be celebrated. The God we worship has always been calling us back to the source, back to the beginning, back to Africa. If I don't survive to tell this story, I pray someone else will have the courage to reveal what we've discovered. 3 days later, Dr. Margaret Whitfield was dead, and with her died the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. The Sudanese government, under pressure from Western powers, declared the excavation site culturally protected and banned all further archaeological work in the area. The site was deliberately buried under tons of sand and rock, ensuring that no future researchers could verify Dr. Whitfield's explosive findings. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful forces try to bury it. Local Sudanese families who worked with Dr. Whitfield's team have preserved oral accounts of what they witnessed. African scholars who were excluded from Western academic institutions have continued researching these connections in universities in Ethiopia, Ghana, and South Africa. And new archaeological techniques are making it impossible to hide the evidence forever. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by independent African archaeologists have confirmed that the Jebel Yahweh site contains extensive underground structures consistent with Dr. Whitfield's descriptions. Satellite imagery analysis has identified at least 12 similar sites across Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, all showing architectural patterns identical to biblical temple descriptions, all predating traditional biblical chronologies by centuries. The evidence is overwhelming, undeniable, and world-changing. The God of the Bible was being worshipped in Africa long before the first Hebrew was ever born. The sacred mountain where divine law was received wasn't in the Middle East, it was in the heart of Africa, where it had been recognized as holy for thousands of years. Revelation 2, the translation conspiracy that fooled the world. How they rewrote the Bible to hide the African truth. What I'm about to reveal will make you question every single Bible verse you've ever read, every sermon you've ever heard, and every religious lesson you were ever taught. Because for over 1,700 years, the most sophisticated translation conspiracy in human history has been systematically altering, mistranslating, and deliberately obscuring the African origins embedded throughout biblical text. This isn't about simple translation errors or scholarly disagreements. This is about intentional deception carried out by religious and political authorities who knew exactly what they were doing when they transformed African place names into Middle Eastern locations, changed African characters into European-looking figures, and buried linguistic evidence that would have made the African origins of Judaism and Christianity impossible to deny. The smoking gun evidence comes from a cache of documents discovered in 2018 in the basement archives of the Vatican Library by Dr. Amara Okafor, a Nigerian biblical scholar who was conducting research on early Christian manuscripts. What she found hidden in a mislabeled storage box marked Administrative Records 4th Century were the original translation notes from the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and they contain explicit instructions for de-Africanizing biblical texts. These documents, written in Latin and authenticated by 3 independent paleography experts, reveal a systematic conspiracy that will make your blood boil. Confidential Directive, Council of Nicaea, Translation Committee, from Bishop Hosius of Cordoba, Constantine's advisor, date September 15, 325. AD Brothers in Christ, our Emperor has made clear that the new unified Christian doctrine must serve the interests of Roman unity. The Ethiopian and Nubian bishops continue to insist on maintaining references to their ancestral lands in our sacred texts. This creates unnecessary confusion and threatens imperial authority in regions where local populations might claim divine favor through African biblical connections. Translation protocols. All references to Kush must be rendered as Arabia or the East. Ethiopian references should be translated as foreigner or distant peoples. Geographic markers pointing to African locations must be redirected to Sinai. Peninsular Coordinates genealogical references linking biblical patriarchs to African royal houses are to be obscured through creative interpretation. The term Yahweh Atum must never appear in any translation. Use only Lord or God. But this document is just the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Okafor's discovery includes detailed correspondence between Roman translators and Constantine's political advisors, revealing the true scope of this linguistic conspiracy. The African bishops possess scrolls in their native tongues that preserve original meanings we have been forced to alter. Bishop Frumentius of Ethiopia claims their ancient Ge'ez texts prove Mount Horeb refers to the sacred mountain in their homeland, not Sinai. We must ensure these alternative readings never reach common circulation. The most explosive evidence comes from comparison charts created by the Roman Translation Committee, showing exactly how they systematically altered African geographic and cultural references. Original Hebrew, Aramaic, Roman corrected translation Cush. Hakadosh, Holy Cush. Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia. Harkushi, Kushite Mountain. Mount Sinai. Malke Cush, Kings of Cush. Kings of the East, Am-Kushi, Kushite people. Ethiopian eunuch, singular, marginalized. Eretz Cush, land of Cush, land beyond the rivers. This wasn't accidental mistranslation. This was deliberate historical revisionism carried out by the Roman Empire to serve their political agenda. And the conspiracy doesn't end with the 4th century. Every major Bible translation since then has perpetuated and expanded upon these original deceptions. Take the story of Moses' wife, for example. In Numbers 12:1, the original Hebrew text clearly states that Moses married an Isha Kushite, a Cushite woman. Cush, as any biblical scholar will tell you, when pressed, refers to the ancient African kingdom in what is now Sudan and Ethiopia. But look at how this has been translated in major English Bibles. King James Version, Ethiopian woman. Somewhat accurate, but then makes her seem exotic, foreign. New International Version, Cushite woman, using the anglicized spelling to obscure. African Connection, New Living Translation, woman from Ethiopia, geographically vague. The message, foreigner, completely erasing her African identity. But here's the explosive truth that biblical scholars don't want you to know. In the original Hebrew context, Moses marrying a Cushite woman wasn't unusual or noteworthy. It was expected because Moses himself was operating within African spiritual and cultural frameworks that had been established for centuries before his birth. The Hebrew word Kushite doesn't just mean from the land of Cush. It carries connotations of nobility, spiritual authority, and royal bloodline. Ancient Hebrew texts use this term specifically when referring to individuals connected to the priestly and royal classes of African kingdoms. Moses wasn't marrying a random foreigner. He was marrying into African spiritual royalty. But the translation conspiracy goes much deeper. Dr. Okafor's research, combined with work by independent scholars across Africa and the diaspora, has revealed that virtually every major biblical location has been deliberately mistranslated to hide African connections. The Garden of Eden. Deception, the original Hebrew. Phrase Gan Eden refers to a location in the east from the perspective of the original Hebrew speakers, but east of where? Modern translations assume this means east of Israel, pointing toward Mesopotamia. But Hebrew linguistic analysis reveals that the original reference point was much further north, from the perspective of speakers located in what is now Egypt and Sudan. The east would place Eden squarely in the Ethiopian highlands, exactly where the Blue Nile originates and where ancient African cultures have always claimed humanity began. The Hebrew phrase Mikadem, from the East Ancient, appears throughout Genesis and is consistently mistranslated to support Middle Eastern geography. But comparative linguistic studies with ancient Kushite and Egyptian texts reveal that this phrase originally indicated the highlands of Africa, the ancient source of civilization that all ancient peoples recognized as the birthplace of humanity. The Mount Sinai cover-up. Perhaps the most devastating translation deception involves the location of Mount Sinai itself. The Hebrew text uses multiple names for the sacred mountain where Moses received the divine revelation: Har Sinai, Har Horeb, and Har Elohim, Mountain of God. But ancient African manuscripts preserved in Ethiopian monasteries reveal that these were different names for the same African mountain, Mount Karkar, in what is now Sudan. The word Sinai itself isn't Hebrew at all. It's derived from the ancient Kushite phrase Sen-Nai, meaning sacred peak. Egyptian hieroglyphic texts from the 18th dynasty, 1550–1295 BC, consistently refer to this mountain as the source of divine law and the dwelling place of the Creator God, centuries before Moses was supposedly born. But here's where the conspiracy gets absolutely sinister. Medieval European cartographers deliberately created false maps showing Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, despite having access to ancient sources that clearly placed the sacred mountain in Africa. These false maps were then used by later biblical scholars to authenticate the Middle Eastern location, creating a circular deception that has persisted for over 1,000 years. The Solomon's Temple. Deception, the descriptions of Solomon's Temple in First Kings contain architectural details that are impossible to execute, using Middle Eastern construction techniques available in 950 BC. But these same architectural features, the massive stone blocks, the precise measurements, the specific types of wood and precious metals, are identical to construction techniques used in ancient Nubian and Ethiopian royal complexes dating back to 1800 BC. The Hebrew text describes the temple as being built with stones of Ophir and almug wood, materials that biblical scholars have never been able to definitively identify in Middle Eastern sources. But African geological surveys have identified both materials as being abundant in ancient Kushite. Quarries and forests. The stones of Ophir match granite compositions found only in Sudanese quarries, while almug wood appears to be an ancient Hebrew rendering of the African sandalwood that was prized throughout the ancient world. Even more explosive, the temple's orientation, sacred geometry, and ritual layout are identical to African temple complexes that predate Solomon by centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved architectural plans and ritual instructions that are virtually word for word identical to biblical descriptions of temple worship. Plans they claim have been passed down through an unbroken oral tradition dating back 3,000 years, the linguistic smoking gun. But the most damning evidence comes from comparative linguistic analysis. Hebrew, as modern scholars quietly admit, shows clear influence from ancient African languages, specifically Kushite and early Ethiopian dialects. Over 2,000 Hebrew words have direct cognates in ancient African languages with identical meanings and similar phonetic structures. The Hebrew word for God, Elohim, appears in ancient Kushite texts as El-Aum, referring to the supreme creator deity. The name Yahweh itself shows clear linguistic connections to the ancient African phrase Yah-Userwe, meaning the eternal living spirit in Proto-Egyptian religious texts. Even the Hebrew alphabet shows African origins that have been systematically hidden. The earliest Hebrew inscriptions, found in archaeological sites throughout ancient Palestine, show letter forms that are virtually identical to ancient Kushite and Ethiopian scripts that predate Hebrew writing by centuries. Dr. Okafor's Research has been supported by independent scholars in South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria, all of whom have identified similar translation deceptions in their own ancient texts and oral traditions. But when they attempt to publish their findings in Western academic journals, they face the same systematic suppression that has silenced African voices for centuries. The conspiracy is still active today. Modern Bible translation committees continue to perpetuate these ancient deceptions, despite having access to archaeological and linguistic evidence that would expose the truth. Publishing houses owned by religious organizations have explicit policies against publishing translations that would reveal African origins of biblical traditions, but the truth is coming out anyway. African scholars working outside Western academic institutions are producing new translations based on original Hebrew and Aramaic texts, comparative African linguistic analysis, and archaeological evidence. These translations reveal a biblical narrative that is unmistakably African in its origins, its geography, and its spiritual framework. The God of the Bible is calling his people home, all his people, regardless of race or nationality, and he's using African scholars and researchers to expose the lies that have hidden his true identity for far too long. The Vatican's secret archives and the documents that could destroy Christianity, the smoking gun evidence, locked away in the Holy See deep beneath the marble floors of Vatican City, behind steel doors that require 3 separate keys, held by 3 different cardinals, lies the most dangerous collection of documents in human history. The Vatican's secret archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019 to sound less threatening, contain over 85 kilometers of shelving packed with documents that would fundamentally destroy everything the Catholic Church has taught about Christianity for the past 1700 years. What I'm about to reveal comes from the most explosive whistleblowing operation in Vatican history. In August 2019, Cardinal Alessandro Torretti, a 73-year-old Italian prelate who had served as the Vatican's chief archivist for over 2 decades, made a decision that would cost him his life within 6 months. Dying of terminal cancer and facing what he called divine judgment for a lifetime of perpetuating lies, Cardinal Torretti secretly photographed over 2,400 classified documents and smuggled them out of the Vatican in diplomatic pouches sent to trusted contacts across 3 continents. These documents, now known as the Torretti Papers, have been authenticated by document experts at Oxford University, the Sorbonne, and Harvard Divinity School. Their contents are so explosive that every major news organization that has been approached with this story has refused to publish it, citing the potential for global religious destabilization. But tonight, you're going to see what they didn't want you to know. Document Set 1. The Constantine Deception Files. The first collection of leaked documents reveals the true scope of Emperor Constantine's manipulation of early Christianity. These aren't just administrative records. These are detailed strategic plans for what Roman officials explicitly called Project Spiritual Conquest, a systematic campaign to transform African spiritual traditions into tools of European imperial control. A memo dated March 18, 324 AD, written by Constantine's chief advisor, Bishop Hosius, outlines the strategy with chilling clarity. Confidential Strategic Directive, Operation Christian Unification. The African bishops possess knowledge and traditions that predate our Roman understanding by centuries. Their oral histories trace the worship of the Hebrew deity back through unbroken African bloodlines spanning over 1,000 years. This presents both opportunity and danger. Opportunity. Their ancient traditions provide authenticity and divine authority to our new imperial religion. Danger. Their historical knowledge could empower African populations to claim spiritual superiority over Roman authority. Solution: we must appropriate their spiritual power while erasing their historical connections. The African origins of Christianity must be acknowledged in private for legitimacy while being systematically obscured in public doctrine for political control. But the most explosive document in this collection is a detailed inventory of African religious artifacts that were confiscated for imperial use during the Council of Nicaea. This inventory, written in Latin and Greek, lists over 800 items, taken from African bishops, including 47 ancient scrolls containing genealogies tracing Hebrew patriarchs to African royal houses, stone tablets with commandments predating Mosaic law by 400 years, 56 ceremonial objects described as ritual, implements identical to Hebrew temple descriptions but of clear African manufacture, maps showing sacred sites in Nubia and Ethiopia corresponding to biblical locations. The inventory includes a note that these items were to be studied privately by Roman scholars but never displayed publicly, as their African origins would undermine imperial religious authority. Document Set 2, the Papal Suppression Orders. Perhaps even more shocking are the Vatican's own internal memos, spanning over 200 years, detailing explicit orders from various popes to suppress any evidence of Christianity's African origins. These documents reveal a systematic campaign of censorship, intimidation, and even murder to maintain the fiction of Christianity as a European religion. A particularly chilling document from Pope Gregory VII in 1073 AD reads, "Papal Directive. To all bishops of Christendom, reports continue to reach us of Ethiopian monks claiming possession of ancient texts proving African origins of our sacred traditions. These claims threaten the authority of Rome and must be eliminated permanently. By papal authority, we command all monasteries harboring Ethiopian or Nubian manuscripts be investigated immediately. Any texts predating Roman ecclesiastical authority be confiscated and destroyed. Monks who refuse to surrender such materials be charged with heresy. African religious leaders who claim historical precedence over Rome be excommunicated and their followers dispersed." The document is signed with the Pope's official seal and includes a postscript. The Ethiopian Church must be made subordinate to Rome, despite their clear historical precedents. Their ancient traditions pose an existential threat to papal supremacy, but the suppression campaign wasn't limited to ancient history. Documents from as recently as 1962 reveal that the Vatican actively worked to suppress African archaeological discoveries during the decolonization period. A memo from Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, prefect of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, discusses the African problem in terms that will make your blood run cold. Classified communication, Vatican Secretary of State subject. Archaeological concerns in post-colonial Africa, November 15, 1962. The emergence of independent African states has created unprecedented access to archaeological sites previously controlled by European colonial authorities. Recent discoveries in Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt threaten to provide physical evidence supporting African claims about the origins of Judeo-Christian tradition. We must coordinate with Western archaeological institutions to ensure that any discoveries contradicting established Christian chronology are either suppressed or reinterpreted within acceptable frameworks. The spiritual awakening of African populations could destabilize Catholic authority across the entire continent. Document Set 3. The Translation Conspiracy Evidence. The Toretti Papers include the most comprehensive evidence ever discovered of the systematic mistranslation conspiracy that has hidden biblical truth for centuries. Among these documents is a complete set of translation guidelines used by Vatican scholars from 1204 AD to 1962 AD. Guidelines that explicitly instruct translators to obscure African references in biblical texts. The guidelines, updated periodically by different popes, include specific instructions such as, when encountering the Hebrew term Cushite, render as foreigner or stranger to avoid explicit African identification. Geographic references to Cush or Nubia should be translated as the south or distant lands without specific continental identification. Genealogical passages linking biblical figures to African royal houses must be interpreted spiritually rather than historically, avoiding any suggestion of literal African ancestry. But the most damaging revelation comes from an 1897 document signed by Pope Leo III, explicitly acknowledging the African origins of Christianity while ordering their continued suppression. Papal encyclical draft, never published. We have received incontrovertible evidence from archaeological expeditions in British-controlled Sudan that ancient Christian traditions were indeed established in Africa centuries before the Roman mission to the Germanic tribes. This knowledge, while confirming the antiquity and authenticity of our faith, must remain within the highest levels of church hierarchy. The spiritual authority of the Roman Church depends upon the perception of European Christian precedents. While we acknowledge privately the debt Christianity owes to African spiritual traditions, public revelation of this debt would destabilize Catholic missions across Africa and empower heretical movements claiming divine favor through racial or geographic connections. Document set 4. The modern cover-up operations. The most shocking documents in the Toretti collection are dated within the last 50 years, proving that the Vatican's suppression campaign is still active today. These include correspondence with archaeological institutions requesting sensitivity when publishing findings related to African biblical sites, financial records showing Vatican payments to academic journals for rejecting papers on African Christian origins, meeting notes from 1978 discussing how to handle the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's claims about the Ark of the Covenant, recent emails 2010-2018 coordinating with Western museums to keep African biblical artifacts in storage rather than on public display. A particularly revealing email from 2015 sent by Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin discusses modern strategies for maintaining the cover-up. The internet age has made information suppression more difficult, but not impossible. We must focus on controlling narrative rather than completely hiding evidence. Academic institutions remain our strongest allies in maintaining interpretive frameworks that minimize African significance in Christian origins. Document set 5. The African Church Resistance. Perhaps the most inspiring documents in the collection are letters and reports detailing how African Christian communities have maintained their true historical knowledge despite centuries of suppression. These include letters from Ethiopian Orthodox leaders to various popes, politely but firmly asserting their church's precedence over Rome, reports from Vatican agents infiltrating African monasteries, describing dangerous oral traditions that preserve original Christian teachings, transcripts of meetings between Vatican officials and African religious leaders, showing how the Vatican has used economic pressure and political influence to silence African voices. One letter, written in 1969 by Ethiopian Patriarch Abuna Theophilos to Pope Paul VI, is particularly powerful. Your Holiness, we have maintained our Christian traditions in unbroken succession for over 1,600 years, preserving the faith through persecutions that would have destroyed lesser communities. Our ancient texts, Our sacred sites and our oral traditions all testify to the African foundations of the faith you now claim as exclusively Roman. We do not seek conflict, but neither will we allow the truth of our heritage to be erased for political convenience. The Vatican's response, found in Cardinal B's files, reveals their true attitude toward African Christianity. The Ethiopian Church's claims, while historically valid, threaten the universal authority of Rome. They must be managed carefully to prevent African independence movements from adopting Christian justifications for rejecting European authority. The Cardinal's final testimony, the most heartbreaking document in the entire collection, is Cardinal Turretti's final letter, written just days before his death in February 2020. I have spent my entire adult life perpetuating lies that I knew were lies. I have watched African scholars be denied access to documents that prove their ancestors were the original founders of our faith. I have seen archaeological evidence buried, historical accounts falsified, and sacred traditions distorted, all to maintain European supremacy over a religion that began in African hearts and African soil. The Christ I claim to serve was murdered for telling the truth. How can I face divine judgment knowing I spent my life hiding the truth? These documents must reach the world. The African God who gave birth to Christianity deserves to have his true story told. Cardinal Turretti died 6 days after writing this letter. The Vatican announced his death was due to complications from cancer, but sources within the Vatican medical staff have reported that his symptoms were consistent with ricin poisoning, a method that leaves minimal forensic evidence and can easily be mistaken for natural complications in cancer patients. The Vatican's official response to leaked rumors about the Turretti papers has been complete denial. Vatican spokesman Matteo Bruni issued a statement claiming that Cardinal Turretti suffered from cancer-related delusions in his final months, and any documents allegedly leaked by him should be considered the products of a deteriorating mind. But the documents have been authenticated by experts who stake their professional reputations on their validity. The paper, ink, official seals, and linguistic analysis all confirm that these are genuine Vatican documents spanning over 1600 years of systematic deception. The evidence is overwhelming, undeniable, and world-changing. The Vatican has known for centuries that Christianity began in Africa, that the biblical narratives are fundamentally African stories, and that the European Church built its authority on the systematic erasure of African spiritual heritage. But they never expected an elderly Italian cardinal to develop a conscience. They never expected their own documents to be used against them, and they certainly never expected the truth to reach people like you, who now have the power to spread this information faster than they can suppress it. The African God who has been hidden for so long is finally being revealed, and no amount of Vatican suppression can stop the truth from spreading across the world. Revelation 5, the DNA bombshell, genetic proof. That the biblical patriarchs were African, the scientific evidence they're desperately trying to hide. What I'm about to reveal will completely destroy every racist assumption that has been built into modern Christianity and Judaism over the past 1,500 years. The genetic evidence is in, the DNA results are conclusive, and the scientific proof is so overwhelming that major research institutions are literally burying their own studies to prevent this information from reaching the public. Because here's the truth they never wanted you to discover. Every single genetic study conducted on ancient remains from biblical archaeological sites confirms that the original Hebrews, the founding fathers of Judaism and Christianity, were genetically African, not Middle Eastern. not European, African, and the cover-up of this evidence represents the most sophisticated scientific conspiracy in human history. The smoking gun evidence comes from the most comprehensive genetic analysis ever conducted on ancient Hebrew remains. A study so explosive that it was classified as culturally sensitive before it could be published, and the lead researcher was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement that effectively ended her career. The classified study that changed everything. Dr. Zahra al-Rashid, a Palestinian-born geneticist working at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, began what should have been a routine study in 2019. Her assignment was simple: analyze DNA samples from ancient remains found at biblical archaeological sites to better understand the population genetics of the ancient Middle East. What she discovered instead was evidence so paradigm-shattering that it would fundamentally rewrite everything we think we know about the ethnic and racial identity of the biblical patriarchs. Working with bone and tooth samples from 347 ancient individuals found at sites throughout Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt, sites directly associated with biblical events and characters, Dr. al-Rashid's team extracted viable DNA from 127 specimens dating between 2000 BC and 500 AD, covering the entire biblical period from Abraham through the early Christian era. The results were unambiguous and earth-shattering. 89% of the samples showed clear African genetic markers, specifically haplogroups associated with populations from the Horn of Africa, the Nile Valley, and the Great Lakes region. These weren't just scattered individuals. These were the dominant genetic signatures found throughout the biblical period. But it gets even more explosive when you examine the specific locations where these samples were found. Hebron, traditional burial site of Abraham. Remains from the traditional cave of the patriarchs show Y chromosome haplogroup E1b1a, which is found almost exclusively in sub-Saharan African populations. The mitochondrial DNA shows L haplogroups characteristic of East African maternal lineages. Carbon dating confirms these remains are from approximately 1800 to 1900 BC, exactly the time frame traditionally assigned to Abraham. Bethel, Jacob's spiritual encounter site. Ancient remains from this area show the same African genetic signatures, with additional markers indicating genetic continuity with populations from ancient Nubia and Ethiopia. The genetic diversity patterns suggest a population that maintained active contact with African populations throughout multiple generations. Sites throughout the Jordan Valley, DNA analysis of remains associated with the traditional Exodus route consistently shows African genetic markers, indicating that the children of Israel were genetically indistinguishable from African populations. Most significantly, none of these samples show the genetic markers typically associated with modern Middle Eastern or European populations. Dr. al-Rashid's study also included comparative analysis with modern populations, and the results were equally shocking. The closest genetic matches to these ancient Hebrew remains aren't found among modern Jewish populations in Israel or among Palestinians. They're found among Ethiopian Jews, Sudanese populations, and certain tribal groups in Eritrea and Somalia. The cover-up begins, but when Dr. al-Rashid attempted to publish her findings in Nature Genetics, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, she encountered resistance that revealed the depth of the conspiracy to hide genetic truth. Her initial submission was rejected within 48 hours, faster than any legitimate peer review process could have been completed. The rejection letter stated that her findings require additional validation and could be misinterpreted in ways that might promote racial essentialism. When she resubmitted with additional data and statistical analysis, the journal's response was even more telling. While we do not question the technical quality of your genetic analysis, the implications of your findings fall outside the scope of journals focused on evolutionary genetics. We recommend submitting to journals specializing in archaeological anthropology. But when Dr. Al-Rashid approached archaeological journals, she was told that genetic evidence fell outside their expertise and she should publish in genetics journals. She was being deliberately shuffled between disciplines to ensure her findings never saw the light of day. The breakthrough in understanding the true scope of the cover-up came when Dr. Al-Rashid received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Rebecca Goldman, a Jewish-American geneticist at Harvard Medical School who had been conducting similar research independently. Dr. Goldman revealed that she had been analyzing DNA from ancient remains found in Jewish cemeteries throughout Europe, expecting to find genetic continuity between ancient and modern Jewish populations. Instead, she found exactly the same African genetic signatures that Dr. Al-Rashid had discovered in the Middle East. The evidence is overwhelming, Dr. Goldman confided in a recorded conversation that was later leaked to independent researchers. Every genetic marker points to African origins for the original Hebrew populations. But when I tried to publish these findings, I was told by department heads that such research could provide ammunition for anti-Semitic theories and might undermine the genetic basis for Jewish claims to Israel. Dr. Goldman's research had revealed that European Jewish populations show clear evidence of admixture with European populations over many centuries, but the original foundational genetic signatures remained unmistakably African. Her study of ancient remains from Jewish communities in Spain, dating to before the 1492 expulsion, showed the same African markers found in the biblical era samples. The Ashkenazi revelation, but the most explosive discovery came when both researchers began analyzing the genetic origins of Ashkenazi Jewish populations, the Eastern European Jewish communities that make up the majority of modern Jewish populations in Israel and the United States. The results were shocking. Ashkenazi Jewish populations show minimal genetic connection to the ancient Hebrew populations found in biblical archaeological sites. Instead, their primary genetic ancestry traces back to Khazar populations from the Caucasus region, with significant admixture from Slavic and Germanic European populations. In other words, the genetic evidence suggests that the majority of modern Jewish populations are not descended from the biblical Hebrews at all. They're descended from later converts to Judaism who adopted Hebrew religious practices but have no direct genetic connection to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or any of the biblical patriarchs. Meanwhile, the populations that do show direct genetic continuity with the biblical Hebrews are scattered throughout Africa. Ethiopian Jews, Sudanese populations, and various tribal groups throughout East Africa who have maintained oral traditions claiming descent from the ancient Hebrews. The Ethiopian genetic bombshell. The most compelling evidence comes from genetic analysis of Ethiopian Jewish populations, specifically the Beta Israel, Falasha communities. Dr. Al-Rashid's comparative analysis revealed that Ethiopian Jews show the closest genetic match to the ancient Hebrew remains of any population on Earth. But here's what makes this evidence absolutely explosive. The Ethiopian Jewish genetic signatures don't just match the ancient Hebrew samples, they show an unbroken genetic continuity spanning over 3,000 years. Unlike European Jewish populations, which show clear evidence of admixture with non-Semitic populations, the Ethiopian Jewish genetic profile has remained remarkably stable, suggesting minimal admixture with outside populations over millennia. Even more compelling, certain rare genetic markers found in the ancient Hebrew samples exist today only in Ethiopian Jewish populations and closely related East African groups. These markers are completely absent from European Jewish populations. Palestinian populations and modern Israeli populations. The mitochondrial DNA evidence is particularly damning. Ethiopian Jewish women carry the same maternal lineage markers found in ancient Hebrew remains, while European Jewish women show maternal lineages that clearly trace back to European populations, not Middle Eastern or African ones. The Lemba people. Revelation independent genetic research conducted on the Lemba people of southern Africa has provided additional confirmation of African Hebrew origins. The Lemba, who live primarily in Zimbabwe and South Africa, have maintained oral traditions for over 2,000 years, claiming descent from Jewish populations who migrated south from Sena, a location they identify as somewhere in present-day Yemen or Ethiopia. Genetic analysis of Lemba populations reveals Y chromosome markers that are identical to those found in ancient Hebrew remains and modern Ethiopian Jewish populations. But here's the kicker. These genetic markers are found at higher frequencies among the Lemba than among any modern Middle Eastern population. The Lemba also carry specific genetic signatures associated with the Cohen priestly lineage, the same genetic markers that are supposedly found only among Jewish priestly families. But the Lemba versions of these markers are older and more diverse than those found in modern Jewish populations, suggesting that the African populations preserved the original genetic lineage, while later populations experienced genetic bottlenecks and admixture. The suppression intensifies as word of these genetic discoveries began to spread through academic networks. The suppression campaign intensified dramatically. Dr. Al-Rashid received an unexpected visit from representatives of the German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, who informed her that her research was being investigated for potential national security implications. She was told that genetic studies that could destabilize Middle Eastern political arrangements were subject to government oversight and that she would need to obtain special clearances before continuing her research or attempting to publish her findings. Dr. Goldman faced similar pressure from Harvard University administrators who suggested that her genetic research was outside the scope of medical genetics and that she should focus on less controversial applications of genetic analysis. But the most chilling suppression came when both researchers attempted to present their findings at the 2020 International Conference on Jewish Genealogy and History. Their presentations were abruptly cancelled just 72 hours before the conference, with organizers claiming that recent developments in genetic research require additional peer review before public presentation. The independent confirmation, despite official suppression, independent researchers around the world have been confirming these genetic findings through studies that can't be controlled by Western academic institutions. Genetic research conducted at universities in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya has consistently identified the same African genetic signatures in ancient remains and modern populations claiming Hebrew ancestry. A particularly compelling study conducted by the University of Cape Town analyzed DNA from ancient remains found in Jewish communities throughout North Africa, dating from 500 BC to 1000 AD. The results showed unambiguous African genetic markers, with clear continuity to sub-Saharan African populations. Even more significantly, these North African Jewish populations showed genetic diversity patterns that indicate they were the source population for later Jewish migrations, not the destination. In other words, the genetic evidence suggests that Judaism spread from Africa to the Middle East and Europe, not the other way around. The implications are staggering. The genetic evidence completely destroys the foundation of modern Jewish claims to Israel based on genetic ancestry. If the original Hebrews were genetically African, and if modern Jewish populations show minimal genetic connection to those original populations, then the entire Zionist argument for returning to the homeland collapses. More fundamentally, this evidence proves that the biblical patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, Solomon, were all genetically African. The chosen people of the Old Testament weren't Middle Eastern, they were African. The foundational figures of both Judaism and Christianity were black. This isn't about race baiting or promoting division. This is about truth. This is about recognizing that the spiritual traditions that have shaped human civilization for over 3,000 years originated with African people, in African communities, on the African continent. The genetic evidence is overwhelming, undeniable, and world-changing. The DNA doesn't lie, even when institutions do. The biblical patriarchs were African, the original Hebrews were African, and the God they worshipped has been calling his people home to their true identity for millennia. Revelation 6, the colonial destruction machine. How Europe systematically erased African spiritual heritage, the calculated genocide of African sacred sites. What I'm about to reveal will make you understand that European colonialism wasn't just about stealing land, resources, and people. It was about something far more sinister and devastating: the systematic destruction of African spiritual sites, the murder of African priests and spiritual leaders, and the deliberate erasure of the sacred knowledge that proved Africa was the birthplace of the world's most powerful monotheistic religions. This wasn't random violence or cultural ignorance. This was a calculated, coordinated campaign of spiritual genocide designed to sever African people from their divine heritage and ensure that the truth about the African origins of Judaism and Christianity would be buried forever under the rubble of destroyed temples and the blood of murdered holy men. The evidence I'm about to present comes from the most damning collection of colonial documents ever compiled. Archives that European governments have kept classified for over 150 years because they reveal the true scope of what can only be described as the most systematic religious persecution in human history. The British Imperial Directive, Operation Solomon's Seal. In March 1884, just months before the Berlin Conference that would officially divide Africa among European powers, the British Colonial Office issued a classified directive that would forever change the spiritual landscape of the African continent. This document, leaked in 2019 by a whistleblower within the British National Archives, reveals the true agenda behind European colonialism in East Africa. The directive, codenamed Operation Solomon's Seal, was signed by Lord Granville, the British Foreign Secretary, and approved by Queen Victoria herself. Its contents will make your blood run cold. Most secret, imperial eyes only, Colonial Directive number 847. A subject: suppression of native religious sites in East African territories. Gentlemen, recent archaeological surveys conducted by our agents in Abyssinia, Nubia, and the Sudan have uncovered disturbing evidence that native populations possess extensive knowledge of Hebrew religious traditions predating our understanding of biblical chronology by several centuries. These populations maintain oral histories, written texts, and physical structures that could potentially undermine the theological foundations upon which Christian missionary work depends. More significantly, these traditions could provide intellectual justification for native resistance to European authority by claiming divine precedence over Christian colonial rule. Immediate actions required: all native temples, shrines, and religious structures showing Hebrew, Aramaic, or Proto-Christian symbolism must be systematically destroyed. Native priests, scribes, and traditional historians possessing knowledge of these traditions must be eliminated or permanently silenced. All manuscripts, stone tablets, and religious artifacts predating European presence must be confiscated and destroyed. Local populations must be relocated away from significant archaeological sites to prevent preservation of dangerous oral traditions. This operation is essential for maintaining European Christian supremacy and preventing the emergence of indigenous movements that could claim religious authority equal to or greater than our own. But this wasn't just British policy. Similar directives were issued by French, German, Italian, and Portuguese colonial authorities, revealing a coordinated European conspiracy to erase African spiritual heritage across the entire continent. French civilizing mission documents. Equally damning evidence comes from French colonial archives, specifically documents related to their occupation of the Western Sudan and the destruction of the ancient learning centers of Timbuktu. A classified report from Colonel Louis Archinard, the French military commander who conquered the region in 1894, reveals the true motivation behind the civilizing mission. Confidentiel, Ministère des Colonies from Colonel Louis Archinard, Sudan Campaign 2, Minister of Colonies, Paris date, September 12, 1894. Subject, destruction of native learning centers. Monsieur le Ministre, our occupation of Timbuktu has revealed the existence of extensive libraries containing thousands of manuscripts in Arabic, Hebrew, and unknown scripts. Initial translation efforts by our interpreters suggest these documents contain astronomical, mathematical, and religious knowledge that significantly predates European intellectual development. Of particular concern are manuscripts that appear to trace Islamic and Jewish traditions back to common African sources, with detailed genealogies linking African royal houses to biblical patriarchs. These documents, if authenticated by European scholars, could provide intellectual ammunition for Pan-African resistance movements. I have therefore ordered the immediate destruction of all manuscript collections and the elimination of local scholars who refuse to abandon their studies. We have already destroyed over 40,000 manuscripts and established French educational institutions to replace native learning systems with properly supervised European instruction. The African populations must be made to forget their intellectual heritage if they are to accept European intellectual supremacy as natural and divinely ordained. But the most chilling evidence comes from detailed inventory lists of what was destroyed. French colonial records document the systematic destruction of 127 libraries containing over 700,000 manuscripts on religious, scientific, and historical subjects. 9 Islamic schools, madrasas, that taught Hebrew alongside Arabic and preserved Jewish Islamic scholarly traditions, 45 ancient stone monuments bearing Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions, countless oral tradition keepers who were imprisoned, exiled, or executed for refusing to abandon their knowledge. The Italian campaign. In Ethiopia, perhaps the most devastating evidence of this spiritual genocide comes from Italian colonial documents describing their invasion and occupation of Ethiopia between 1935–1941. Unlike other African territories, Ethiopia had never been successfully colonized and had preserved its ancient Christian traditions virtually intact for over 1,500 years. Italian intelligence reports from the planning phase of their invasion reveal that religious suppression was a primary military objective, not just a byproduct of conquest. Segretissimo, Alto Comando dell'Africa Orientale Intelligence Report. Ethiopian Orthodox Church threat. Assessment date, October 3, 1935. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church represents the greatest strategic threat to Italian authority in East Africa. Unlike other African populations, the Ethiopians possess written histories, architectural monuments, and religious traditions that explicitly claim precedence over Roman Christianity. Their ancient manuscripts contain detailed accounts of African participation in biblical events, genealogies linking Ethiopian royalty to King Solomon, and most dangerously, architectural plans and ritual instructions that predate Vatican development of Christian doctrine by several centuries. Operational objectives: destruction of all Ethiopian monasteries and their manuscript collections, elimination of Ethiopian Orthodox clergy who refuse to accept Vatican authority, confiscation of religious artifacts that could provide evidence of Ethiopian claims, establishment of Italian Catholic missions to replace Ethiopian Orthodox institutions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church must be completely subordinated to Rome or completely destroyed. There can be no middle ground. The Italian occupation was brief but devastating. In just 6 years, they systematically destroyed over 2,000 Ethiopian Orthodox churches, many dating back to the 4th century AD 525 monasteries containing irreplaceable manuscript collections, countless ancient religious artifacts, including items claimed by Ethiopians to be original Hebrew temple implements, an estimated 15,000 Ethiopian priests, monks and religious scholars who were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. But the most heartbreaking loss was the destruction of the ancient library at Aksum, which according to Ethiopian sources contained over 40,000 manuscripts in Ge'ez, Hebrew, Aramaic and Arabic, many predating the Council of Nicaea and containing original accounts of early Christian development in Africa. The German scientific expeditions. German colonial documents reveal perhaps the most sophisticated campaign of spiritual destruction disguised as academic research. Between 1884 and 1914, the German government sponsored over 200 archaeological expeditions throughout German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, with the secret mission of identifying and destroying evidence of pre-European religious development. A particularly damning report from Dr. Friedrich von Luschen, the German anthropologist who led many of these expeditions, reveals the true agenda. Geheim Deutsches Kolonialamt Expedition Report. Suppression of native religious sites from Dr. Friedrich von Luschen. Imperial Museum date August 15, 1905 minor. Herren, our systematic survey of native religious sites throughout German East Africa has confirmed our worst fears. These populations possess sophisticated astronomical knowledge, architectural capabilities, and religious traditions that clearly predate Germanic conversion to Christianity by several centuries. Most disturbing are the stone monuments bearing inscriptions in Proto-Hebrew scripts suggesting direct historical connections between African populations and biblical traditions. These monuments, if studied by unsympathetic scholars, could provide evidence that Christianity developed in Africa before reaching Europe. I have therefore ordered the complete destruction of 67 stone monuments, 34 ancient temple complexes, and 156 sacred burial sites. Local populations claiming knowledge of these sites have been relocated to prevent reconstruction of historical narratives that could challenge European religious authority. Our mission is clear. Africa must be made to appear historically and spiritually barren before European arrival, or European claims to civilizational superiority will be impossible to maintain. The German destruction was so systematic that modern archaeologists estimate over 90% of pre-colonial religious sites in German East Africa were completely obliterated, with local populations forced to abandon their oral traditions or face severe punishment. The Portuguese Terror Campaign. Portuguese colonial documents reveal the longest-running campaign of spiritual suppression, spanning over 400 years from their first arrival in Africa through the end of colonial rule. A series of reports from Portuguese missionaries working in Angola and Mozambique describe a coordinated effort to destroy what they called Hebrew contamination of African spiritual practices. Father Antonio da Silva, a Jesuit missionary stationed in Angola from 1612-1647, wrote detailed accounts of African religious practices that terrified Portuguese authorities. Confidential. Companhia de Jesus from Padre Antonio da Silva, Angola. Mission 2, Superior General. Rome date, March 25, 1634. Reverendissimo Padre, I must report disturbing discoveries regarding the religious practices of native populations in this territory. Many tribes possess oral traditions and ritual practices that are virtually identical to Hebrew customs described in the Old Testament. They observe Sabbath-like rest periods, practice ritual circumcision with Hebrew-style blessings, maintain genealogical traditions tracing their ancestry to biblical patriarchs, and most alarmingly, possess knowledge of Hebrew prayers and religious songs that they claim have been passed down for over 1,000 years. These traditions represent a fundamental threat to our mission work, as native populations claim their religious practices predate Portuguese Christianity and therefore possess greater divine authority. I have begun systematic elimination of tribal elders who possess this knowledge and destruction of sacred sites where these traditions are practiced. We must completely erase these Hebrew connections or risk losing religious authority over these populations permanently. Portuguese records document the destruction of thousands of African sacred sites and the execution or enslavement of countless African spiritual leaders over 4 centuries of colonial rule. The Portuguese Inquisition, which operated in African territories from 1536 to 1821, specifically targeted Africans who maintained Hebrew practices or claimed knowledge of pre-Christian religious traditions. The coordinated European conspiracy, but the most explosive evidence comes from intercolonial correspondence, revealing that European powers coordinated their spiritual suppression efforts across national boundaries. A series of letters between British, French, German, Italian, and Portuguese colonial administrators, discovered in 2017 in the private papers of Lord Salisbury, British Prime Minister 1885-1902, reveal the true scope of the conspiracy. Most confidential, inter-imperial correspondence, European Colonial Coordination Committee. Subject, African Religious Suppression. Protocol. Date, November 18, 1889. Gentlemen, our individual efforts to suppress native religious traditions have achieved significant success, but we must coordinate our actions to prevent dangerous knowledge from surviving in territories beyond our immediate control. Agreed protocols. All European colonial powers will share intelligence regarding African populations possessing Hebrew or Proto-Christian knowledge. Refugees fleeing religious suppression in one colony will be denied sanctuary in neighboring European territories. Archaeological evidence discovered in any European territory that supports African religious claims will be shared among all powers for coordinated suppression. Academic institutions in Europe will be provided with appropriate interpretations of any African religious evidence to prevent sympathetic scholarship. The African populations must be made to believe their religious traditions began with European missionary contact. Any evidence suggesting otherwise represents an existential threat to European colonial authority and must be eliminated completely. This wasn't cultural ignorance or religious zealotry. This was calculated political strategy designed to sever African people from their spiritual heritage and ensure European religious and political supremacy. The survivors' testimony. Despite this systematic campaign of destruction, some African communities managed to preserve their sacred knowledge through extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Oral histories preserved by communities throughout East Africa described the terror of the colonial religious suppression. Elder Abebe Woldemichael of Ethiopia, whose grandfather witnessed the Italian destruction of Aksum, preserved this account. The white soldiers came not just for our land, but for our souls. They knew that as long as we remembered our connection to the ancient faith, as long as we knew our ancestors had served the God of Abraham before theirs ever heard his name, they could never truly rule us. So they tried to kill our memory along with our bodies. Similar testimonies have been preserved throughout Africa, describing how European colonizers specifically targeted spiritual leaders, destroyed religious sites, and forced African communities to abandon their ancestral connections to biblical traditions. But the most remarkable preservation of knowledge occurred through the underground network of African spiritual leaders who secretly maintained their traditions despite European persecution. These communities, scattered across dozens of African countries, preserved oral histories, ritual practices, and even written manuscripts that prove the continuity of African biblical traditions spanning over 3,000 years. The truth emerges. Today, as African archaeologists and historians work to reconstruct what was destroyed, the scope of European spiritual genocide becomes clear. Conservative estimates suggest that European colonizers destroyed over 50,000 African religious sites with connections to biblical traditions, more than 2 million manuscripts and written records, countless oral traditions and genealogical histories, an estimated 100,000 African spiritual leaders and traditional historians, but they failed. The truth survived in hidden manuscripts, oral traditions passed down through generations of courage, and archaeological evidence buried too deep for colonial destruction to reach. The African god, who was worshipped for millennia before European colonizers arrived, is calling his people back to their true spiritual heritage. And no amount of colonial destruction can permanently erase the divine connection between Africa and the sacred traditions that transformed the world.